For Capcom, and likely many of us that follow its works, Resident Evil 5 is like the awkward middle child of the franchise that's too scary to be pure action, too loud to be survival horror, and released at the exact moment that Capcom thought co-op was the future of video gaming. It sold like wildfire, split the fanbase in half, and quietly rewired what Resident Evil will become for the next decade. Resident Evil 5 doesn't haunt the franchise because it failed, it actually haunts it because it worked. It sold absurdly well, it reviewed well, it turned Chris Redfield into a global action hero and pushed Resident Evil firmly into the blockbuster space. On paper, you see, it was a victory lap. In reality, it was a moment the series quietly stepped away from what once made it special. And that's why a Resident Evil 5 remake, if it happens, isn't just another nostalgia project riding the success of the Resident Evil 2 and 4's success. It's more like a philosophical crossroads, a chance, maybe for Capcom, to look directly at one of the most divisive chapters and ask a very dangerous question. But before we get to that, remaking Resident Evil 5 is not about better lighting, smoother gunplay, or prettier enemies. It's about deciding what Resident Evil is in a post-Resident Evil 4 remake world. When Resident Evil 5 launched in 2009, the industry was different. Bigger was better. Louder meant progress. Co-op was the future. Horror was something you outgrew once the guns got bigger and the budgets exploded. Resident Evil 5 in fact didn't abandon survival horror overnight, it eroded it. Slowly and smartly, like ammo was plentiful, enemies were aggressive but predictable. Fear gave way to momentum, tension was replaced with efficiency, and Shiva wasn't just a partner, she was a statement. Resident Evil was no longer about isolation, it was about synchronization. Covering angles, sharing ammo, solving combat encounters like puzzles designed for two people who trusted each other. And for some players, this was thrilling, for others it was almost sacrilege. And both, of course, were right. The thing is, Capcom's recent remakes didn't just modernize old games, you know that, they reinterpreted them. Resident Evil 2 turned mixed camera dread into intimate, relentless pressure. Resident Evil 3 reframed Nemesis as a stalking force rather than a scripted jump-scare machine, and Resident Evil 4 Remake did the unthinkable. It made a beloved action game scarier, heavier, and more introspective without losing its soul. In fact, Resident Evil 4 proved that Capcom's no longer interested in blind preservations, they're interested in revision with intent, which makes Resident Evil 5 both exciting and at the same time terrifying. The biggest challenge for Resident Evil 5 Remake is not cultural sensitivity right now, co-op balance, or enemy redesign, it's fear. Resident Evil 5 rarely let players feel vulnerable. Chris was like a tank. Enemies swarmed, but rarely surprised. Death came from chaos, not dread. You weren't scared of the dark, you were clearing it. And we think because of that, a remake has to change that fundamental relationship, not by removing action entirely, but by reframing power, making every fight feel costly, making cooperation feel fragile rather than empowering, turning co-op from a safety net into a source of anxiety. Resident Evil 5 doesn't need to be forgiven, it needs to be understood. Of course, a remake should treat it less like a celebration and more like an autopsy, asking why the game drifted towards success and what was lost along the way. The goal is then to erase these action roots, of course, but to give them weight. If Capcom gets this right, Resident Evil 5 Remake could become the most mature entry in the series, not because it's darker or louder, but because it finally knows when to hold. On another angle, at its best, the Resident Evil 5 Remake could reframe the entire middle chapter of the franchise. This is the point where heroes stopped being scared and started being legends. And that transition deserves context, not noise. A smarter remake would slow the pace, let silence breathe and make co-op feel tense instead of convenient. If Capcom leans into restraint instead of spectacle, Resident Evil 5 could finally become the missing emotional bridge between survival horror and full-blown action. Like, imagine this. You don't just protect Shiva, you worry about her. Not because of the bad AI, but because the game demands trust, communication, and restraint. We think the lazy solution to this would be to strip co-op down or make it optional. The brave solution, however, is to redesign it entirely. And a modern Resident Evil 5 remake could make co-op asymmetrical, one player stronger, the other more vulnerable. Limited information, split objectives, moments where separation isn't a failure, it's inventable. If you're an old Resident Evil player, you know horror doesn't come from being alone, it comes from being responsible for someone else when you can barely survive yourself, like Resident Evil 4. Capcom already knows how to do this. They've flirted with it in Resident Evil Revelations, Resident Evil 6 and its better moments, and even Village companion segments. So we think Resident Evil 5 is where they can finally commit. One of the quiet criticisms of Resident Evil 5 has always been tone, not just setting, tone. It was loud, confident, self-assured, believed in its own spectacle so much that it forgot to be unsettling. A remake has the opportunity to slow everything down, let silence linger, let the horror of bioorganic warfare feel tragic instead of flashy. This is a game about infection, exploitation, and collapse, themes that hit harder now than they ever did back in 2009. Chris Redfield doesn't need to be rewritten or anything that insane, but examined. Also, Shiva doesn't need to be reintroduced, she kinda needs to be more centered. A wiser remake doesn't sanitize the past, would say, it contextualizes it. Resident Evil 5's identity crisis came from success, and Capcom chased what worked, which it did until it didn't. All things considered, Resident Evil 4 Remake already showed how to pull this off. Enemies smarter, encounters tighter, mistakes punished quickly. We think Resident Evil 5 Remake needs to follow that path, not escalate it, because the moment it leans too far into spectacle, it stops being Resident Evil again. The remake is not just another entry in Capcom's assembly line, it's the last unresolved chapter of the franchise's identity shift. Resident Evil 1 to 3 were about survival, Resident Evil 4 was about reinvention, Resident Evil 5 was expansion and excess. If Capcom can remake Resident Evil 5 with restraint, fear, and narrative clarity, it closes the loop. It proves that the series has learned its own history instead of running from it. If they can't, if they chase numbers, noise, and nostalgia, then Resident Evil 5 will remain what it has always been: successful, controversial, and permanently uncomfortable to talk about. The real question isn't will it ever happen, it's why it should. Because a Resident Evil 5 remake doesn't exist to remind us how far the series went, it exists to show how far it has come. Done right, it won't just remake a game, it'll rewrite a moment, and finally makes peace with it. And that's a risk we think worth taking.